Hello and welcome to Vibrant Lives podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to your health and well-being, featuring interviews with experts about nutrition, physical and mental health, and my 5-minute food fact series. I'm Amanda Hayes, your host. I'm a lawyer turned nutritionist with a passion for learning about how to live a vibrant life through practicing mindfulness and meditation, eating a nourishing healthy diet, and moving my body and sharing what I learn with you here on this podcast. Before I introduce today's guest, I'll note that although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Vibrant Lives podcast is not intended to be used to treat or prevent any injuries or medical conditions, and it is never a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I'm here with behaviour change specialist Dr. Heather McKee. Heather lives in Dublin but speaks to us from France. Hopefully in the not too distant future, us Aussies will be able to travel too. Heather is interested in health-related behaviour change and the psychology behind what motivates people to adopt and stick to healthy goals. She has created excellent online courses to help people achieve lasting healthy habits, and today we'll hear all about how to do just that. Today I am here with Heather McKee, a behavioural change specialist. And to start the podcast, I'd like to get to know a little bit about Heather. So Heather, welcome to Vibrant Lives podcast.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
It's such a pleasure. So let's start with some quick fire questions. Heather, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Dublin in Ireland. So just by the Irish Sea there at the bottom of the Dublin Mountains.
Oh, beautiful. And what is your favourite form of exercise?
Oh, that's so hard. Let me think about that one. I love walking and horse riding. I'm going to be greedy too.
Oh, horse riding. Wow, that sounds great. And Heather, your go-to meal for dinner?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, because I'm in France at the moment, my go-to is a goat cheese salad. Everywhere I go, it's always different. And I just want to have one everywhere I go.
Oh, lucky you. So what are you reading right now?
I am reading a book called The Extended Mind. And it's all about how we actually think a lot with our bodies, not just with our brain. And even to the point, it's so interesting, like they're talking about people learn languages quicker when they gesticulate more, because they're using their body to interpret languages better. So I've only just started it, so I won't, give all of the insights, but it's so interesting learning how kind of like our interoceptive awareness affects our bodies and the way we think and the way we learn.
Gosh, that sounds absolutely fascinating. There's so much to learn about our bodies and our brains, isn't there?
Mm.
And what are you enjoying listening to at the moment? Either book, audiobook, music?
I'm going to be a really big nerd and say this morning I was listening to your podcast with Jessica Lee, which I just found so incredible. So inspiring. I think her work is incredible. I just really, really love that. Otherwise, I'm really enjoying The Happiness Lab by Larry Santos. All about the science behind positive psychology. I really, really recommend it if anyone hasn't checked it out. I'm a big fan.
Oh, that sounds great. And I'll put a link in the show notes. And Heather, your favourite holiday destination, although it sounds like you might be in one.
I'm lucky enough to be here at the moment, but yeah, I do. I suppose, at the moment, France is one of my favorite places. I think if I could go anywhere in the world, probably Japan would be one of my favorite places to visit. So all being well, and we can travel in the future to places as far from as Japan, I would love to go.
Yes, I love Japan as well. So Heather, let's talk about your work. So you clearly have an interest in sport and physical activity, as those are the areas in which you started your tertiary study. So where did that interest come from?
Great question. I suppose I remember laughing when I was in school and my careers guidance teacher told me that you could do a degree in sport science. Because I just thought that sounds far too fun to be a legitimate degree. I suppose I was interested more in the physical activity element than the sport. I wasn't very, I like to think of myself as more collaborative than
Hmm.
competitive. But back then it wasn't really a thing to be into like wellness or fitness. And so, you're either into sport or not. And so, it was quite interesting, going into, both of my degrees where there's all these elite athletes and then me plodding along that just love to be well and stay well and and obviously now the tide has turned and there's so many people interested in wellness, which is it's just wonderful. But my kind of passion was making it accessible for everyone, and I was quite interested in how do we help people with long-term conditions, exercise, how do we help people with disabilities, or limited abilities, exercise. And I think that was where my passion for really kind of health promotion and behaviour change came from.
So you were ahead of your time, really, in that way, weren't you? Because as you said, a lot of people attracted to that kind of study were athletes, but you were thinking more broadly.
I don't know. It's based on my class that showed that I was behind I was behind everyone else because I wasn't into sports as much. I still love sports.
So you were running a healthy lifestyle clinic for hospital staff, and you noticed
Mm.
that people often had great intentions and goals, but sticking to those goals was difficult. So what were some of the reasons that you learnt as to why it was difficult for people to stick to their goals?
Yeah, this you've really done your research, Amanda. I love it. Yeah, it was for people with metabolic syndrome. So anyone who had kind of diabetes, was struggling with heart conditions or anything else. And we had the best nutritionists and the best physical activity experts, and yet we couldn't make people's changes stick. And I found this incredibly frustrating after spending years learning about, like, the benefits of exercise and nutrition and everything else, and thinking everyone would be as excited and wanting to change, things as much as I was. And so what I did was I actually sat down with all 60 people in the clinic and talked through, what was it that was holding them back. And this is really what got me hooked on health behavior change, was that everyone's kind of reasons were different. Yes, there were some themes, but everyone had their own individual barriers that were holding them back. And actually, you can have all the perfect, I like to think of diet and exercise and sleep tips and stress management as the ingredients in the recipe for change. But ultimately, behavior change psychology is to methodology. So it's how you take these ingredients and it's how you apply them to your life. And that's ultimately the recipe for health, because a lot of people don't know what to do with the ingredients, or, they know about the ingredients, but they don't know how to apply it to their complex, busy lives with all their barriers and past histories and everything else. And so I really felt like understanding more about people's barriers and what got in their way and also what helped them, all of that behavioral psychology piece that I kind of unlocked at that time, really gave me an insight into really how to support people to change.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because, as you say, you can have the ingredients. We all know it's healthy to move our bodies and to go for a walk or a run or whatever we like to do. But you're right, just knowing that and doing it, there can be a gap between those two things. And I guess that's where you come in. So you became fascinated about the psychology behind motivation, and you went on to do a PhD. So what were you looking at in your PhD?
I was looking at ultimately psychology of behavior change, and I was looking at why some people are able to stick to their habits long term, their healthy habits, and why so many other people failed. And it was fascinating because what we looked at multiple things. We looked at how people managed their goals, how people managed temptation, what kind of skills people had. And ultimately it led to an intervention where we trained people in key psychological factors that we knew from the research and from our past studies were best supportive of people to maintain their habits long term versus a typical diet and exercise program that people would get. And what we found was actually when they were given the psychological skills alone, so they weren't allowed to change their exercise or change their diet necessarily. they lost as much weight, they had as much increase in positive markers of anxiety, of depression, of mindful awareness, of all different markers of vibrancy as those that actually had an intervention that looked at just their diet and exercise. And so it's really interesting because it showed us that, the power of psychology before you even do anything to do with, changing the way you eat or changing the way you move, actually changing your psychology. It's such a powerful impact on all these physiological measures and psychological measures too.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I mean, weight loss is an absolutely perfect example of that, because I think most people, or many people at least, know that losing weight is difficult. But in fact, the research shows that the losing weight bit is not necessarily the hardest bit. The hardest bit is keeping the weight off, which obviously involves, I would say, some kind of habit change. So that ties into what you said about the power of psychology. Specifically when it comes to weight loss, what are some of the reasons why it's hard for people to keep the weight off or to change their habits? What are some of the barriers there?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I honestly, I believe it's because we're taught a lot of myths, or we have a lot of beliefs around what works for habit change that are quite misinformed. And I always think, before we kind of set out in any journey to change our habits, we need to know what those beliefs that we hold are. And often I tend to do a talk for companies on this about the myths of habit change. And, one of them is, well, there's kind of 5 key myths, but I could bore you all day with them, but I'll give you an example of one of them. But, we believe that, we have to set ourselves a big outcome goal, to be able to be successful. So we believe that we need to set ourselves a goal around a certain number on the scales, or, maybe it's a certain number in time in a race, or a certain number of steps on our fitness tracker, and all of these things are helpful at the start, and exactly like you said, Amanda, they can be helpful to an extent, but actually when it comes to long-term maintenance, they're not necessarily what is going to keep us going in the trenches. And these are called extrinsic motivators or outcome goals. Mm-hmm. And even they found in, Olympic gold medal athletes that are so obsessed with, getting to a particular outcome goal, when they get there, the joy of being there is fleeting. And we often see this in weight loss. People get to a certain weight in the scales and they're like, yes. And then they put themselves under pressure to step it up and lose more and do more. And actually, that's when things start to spiral, and they put too much pressure on themselves, and actually they're not enjoying pursuing their goal anymore. They're pursuing it just for this number alone. Yeah. Whereas, what we've seen in the literature is that those that have formed goals for intrinsic reasons, and intrinsic translates into the Latin word for inward, which means goods for our soul. And I love that word, because it's like, if people follow goals because they're part of who they are, because they're meaningful for them, because they personally represent something that's important to them in their lives, they're the type of people that are much more likely to sustain those goals long term. Mm-hmm. And so instead of, it's not just about losing weight to get a number on the scales. It's losing weight because it gives you more energy, because it allows you to be the person that you want to be. It allows you to play with your kids or your grandkids. It allows you, eating a better diet allows you to focus better at work. It allows you to show up better for the people you love. It allows you to sleep more. It allows you to be more yourself in your life. And ultimately, intrinsic motivation, it's that motivation that is tied up with your values, your sense of self, your sense of identity, who you see yourself in the world. Because ultimately, what is the point of following any goal that isn't aligned with who you want to be and what you wish to create in the world? And what we've seen time and time again in studies is that those that have those habits that are formed for intrinsic reasons are much more likely to stick to them. So I always say to anyone who's starting off on any kind of health goal journey is to start with why. Why is this important to you? And so instead of it becoming, a number on your fitness tracker, if you can ask yourself, why often enough. And I often say, it takes 5 whys to get to your true why. So your goal is to get fitter. Why is it important for you to get fit? Okay, I want to have more energy, but why is that important? Well, because I want to make more of a contribution at home and at work. Why is that important? Because actually someone that makes a difference in the world, be it at work, be it at home, be it in my community, is something that's quite important to me. I want to be able to make a contribution. And then, instead of it being getting a certain time in a race, being fitter just takes on a whole new meaning for people, and it becomes embedded in part of who they are.
I can really understand why that could be very motivating, because I think also the culture that we live in now, we have so much access to images and information. People, I think, can become obsessed perhaps with comparing themselves to others. Mm. And they're not intrinsic goals. You really need to focus on how you want to be as a person, as you say, and let that be your motivating factor. Heather, while we're talking about goals, because that's one of your areas of expertise, is setting goals that lead to lasting change, let's take a step right back to the very basics. And can you tell us, why is having a goal important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first and foremost, goals help you direct your attention in one way. They're almost like the organization system for your life's intentions. And I think that's really, really important that, we start to understand our goals a little bit better. But like I just said, it's not just about those extrinsic goals. Yes, we can have numbers related goals, but anytime we're setting a goal, it's very, very important to understand, well, what does this give me back in my life? What does it allow me to be? Who does it allow me to be in life? And I think that's very, very important. I think the other key thing when it comes to setting goals is, and something that we saw in our studies, is that when we start out, so let's take January as an example, or even, over here in Europe, a lot of people see September as kind of a mini reboot and a mini reset. And I suppose for you guys as well, going into summer might feel that way as well. And we assume, we often want to make all of the changes when a new time of year rolls around. So, we want to go to the gym every day. We want to cut down on sugar. We want to save more money. We want to go on social media less. We want to be nice to our other halves, all of the things. And actually, the more goals we add in, the more we take away from our focal goal. And it's a concept in psychology known as goal dilution. And the more we dilute our effectiveness. And the interesting thing about this is that approaching your goals in this way, it uses up your willpower, and ultimately it makes you less likely to succeed, because willpower is like a muscle. So if you train it, if I go to the gym every day for the next week and just train my left bicep, by the time I get to the end of the week, I wouldn't be able to even lift up like a cup of tea or a glass of water. But, if I give myself adequate rest and recovery, if I go once a week for the next 7 weeks, it's much more likely that that's going to build a habit than, I kind of blow out all my willpower in the first week. And so, the same goes for adopting any goal or creating habits around your goals, is that it needs to be a gradual process in order for it to be sustainable. It needs to be achieved through consistent, small and positive changes to your life. Because interestingly, the research shows that it's these smaller, simpler actions that actually become habits more quickly. And so I always say to people, instead of trying to do everything at once when you start off with a goal, focus on making one small change and doing that consistently.
I would like to talk about that in a bit more detail, but you mentioned goal dilution, having, for example, in September in Europe, or perhaps in January for our New Year's resolutions, we want to do 10,000 things to make ourselves better. So how many goals then do you think it's realistic to have? What's a good number of goals?
That is a really interesting question. So if it comes to your health, what they found, and I'm going to be really honest here, what they found is you can only really pursue one thing well at a time. And interesting that a lot of the habit research is based, well, there was one interesting study where they got people, they tried to help them create flossing habits. And they got them to floss their teeth after they brushed their teeth every night. So the brushing their teeth was an anchor point. It was a habit that people had well established. It's something that, they did time and time again. So they piggybacked flossing onto the back of this. But they told people that they only had to floss one tooth. While it feels laughably small and we all giggle at it, actually, making those goals so tiny, really help people then engage with it. Because once people did the 1-2, they thought, oh, well, I'm here anyway. I might as well do a couple more. And that's actually what really helps in terms of long-term habit change. We think that it's insignificantly small, but cumulatively over time, that has a big impact. But the key is that change is so small, it doesn't feel too punishing or restrictive, and therefore it doesn't use up too much of our, precious willpower.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to call these small changes bite-sized changes, because they're so small that, they're so approachable. They feel like, just small bite size. But the thing is, if we pursue multiple goals at once, we are spreading our willpower too thinly. And so what we need to do is start with one small, I say often, if it doesn't pass a giggle test, if it's not laughably small enough, it might not be small enough. And what it does over time is that actually builds your self-efficacy or self-confidence, because every time you follow through on that small change, you represent to yourself that you are someone that follows through with your goals, that you are someone that succeeds. And over time that compounds, and then you can start to make things a little bit more difficult. But the problem is we all rush at it at the start, and we use up all our willpower and all our motivation because we're super motivated at the start. But we have to play the long game. We have to think about, I always say, Amanda, it's not like you lay in bed, this morning before you woke up and weighed up the pros and cons of dental hygiene, or decided if you're motivated enough to brush your teeth or anything else. You did it because it's a habit that you had. And that's the beauty of habits. Like, they're non-conscious processes. We do them automatically.
Yes.
But if we want to establish a habit over time, we need to make it easy enough for ourselves to want to engage with it often enough that we repeat it, that it becomes a non-conscious process. And it's not like, we just brush our teeth in January and then our dental hygiene is done for the rest of the year. We need to keep at these things. And I think it's very important that when people are setting a goal, that they look at this as a lifelong goal.
Yes.
They look at, well, how do I set this up in a way that's going to support me for this year, for next year, for beyond, rather than just for this period of time or for this 3 or 4 weeks. And so that's why, it's very important to break down our goals into habits. Yes, we might have a goal of getting fitter, but what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
So to start with, you find a very, or as you say, a bite-sized habit to start implementing your goal. How do you go along adding to that habit, and how do you know when you're ready to, I guess, extend that habit to, for example, you floss 2 teeth instead of 1, or you run 2 kilometres instead of 1. Does that sort of happen naturally, or should we have timelines for our goals, or how do you suggest we move along that path?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And unfortunately, it isn't as formulaic as we like to think. And it's all about experimentation. Because the thing is, if we feel, a week or 2 and we feel confident and we start doing a little bit more, but actually, for example, one thing a lot of people do, when they start out healthy eating is they do everything at once. So they end up eating, steamed fish and broccoli every night, and then after a week or 2 they get quite bored of that. It's very hard to do, and so it is very much you independently actually growing your habit muscle and your experimentation muscle, and saying, okay, actually now this is too much for me, because now I'm not wanting to engage in this habit anymore. I'm actually, slacking off on it a little bit. And I think it's important to understand that about yourself, because it's very important on your habit change journey to fail. Failure is one of the most valuable things on your journey. And so if you find that actually, if you've got a week or 2 and you're flossing 1 or 2 or 3 teeth a night, or and then you go and you say, well, now I have to floss them all because I've started doing more, and actually that's making you less likely to engage in the habit, then going back to the small steps will help you. But, it's okay to set timelines around particular goals, but the important thing is that we're not rushing ourselves into it, because what we're looking here is to create long-term change. It's not just about change for a season. It's not just about change for a particular wedding or event or birthday coming up. It's about change for life. And so if you commit to the fact that you're actually going to be doing this for life, then you can start to give yourself permission to try things, get things wrong. Another example is, if we're trying to set up a meditation habit, and maybe we think, oh, well, we all have to do 10 or 20 minutes because that's what we're told to do. And maybe we think we need to do it in the morning because having the perfect morning routine is what we hear, all healthy people do. But if you're trying to get your kids out of bed in the morning and get them ready for school, that might not be the best time of day for you. And maybe actually for you, it's just when you boil the kettle when everyone's gone to school in the morning or everyone's sat down to do their work in the morning. And it's those 3 minutes that you do to take your breath each morning, and you start with that, and then over time you feel quite confident doing that, and you feel like actually around lunchtime is another time that I want to start bringing in my breath practice, my meditative practice, and you experiment with that, and I think habit formation is all about a series of experiments over time. You gain that feedback, you look at what works, and then you look at growing that slowly then over time. And as cheesy as it sounds, it's about the journey, it's about the process rather than, just a particular outcome. And that's the difference between habits and goals. It's about, setting things up in a way to make them as easy enough to repeat. So then they become non-conscious, just like toothbrushing. They're just something you naturally do.
So Heather, you mentioned failure being part of it. So if we do fail, for example, if we are trying to cut down on sugar and then we eat a chocolate bar, or we are trying to meditate and we have a day where we don't at all. I mean, I think it's a common response sometimes when we fail to think, oh, this is all too hard, and just completely abandon it. So how do you suggest we reset ourselves to get back on the pathway?
Yeah, got a wonderful question. I love that. Yeah, and it was interesting because in one of our studies we found, we examined long-term maintainers, so those people that were able to maintain their healthy habits long-term over years versus those that maybe maintain them for a while and then relapsed. And the difference was that those who were successful at sticking to long-term health goals, they had a different outlook on failure. So once they did something contradictory to their goals, they looked to learn from it. So they examined why they gave in to temptation. Was it because if they had a chocolate bar, was it because they were hungry or stressed or tired or bored or emotional? And what we did then in our subsequent studies was we looked at, well, when did people give in to temptation most and why? So we got them to track their temptations. So then they understood a little bit more about, okay, there's certain times of day that I'm more vulnerable. There's certain times when actually certain emotions drive me to give in to temptation. And it was that curiosity around that really helped those individuals actually learn from their failure over time to make them success. And the interesting thing is, I always say, and it comes from, and I can't take credit for this, but it comes from a quote from James Clear, which is about habit change is about system change. If you failed, it's not you that's failed, it's your system that's failed. Right. And if you can change your system, then change can happen for you. And so it's really important that people look at themselves rather than berate themselves about a lack of willpower. Understand that, we all give in to temptation. Every human is going to give in to temptation. But understanding that that's a temporary lapse, and actually, your valued, your deep intrinsic goal is worth more than, straying just because of one temporary lapse. Yeah. And actually examining why you've strayed and how you could overcome that in the future is so important. And there's a specific technique for doing that, which I can explain if it's helpful.
Yeah, sure.
So there's loads of research on this. Actually, hundreds of studies have shown that having a plan, I like to call it a failure plan, because let's get comfortable with the word failure, because we're all going to fail. We're all human. That's part of our human DNA. But it's known as in psychology as implementation intentions, and that's been consistently linked with long-term habit adherence. So basically, it's about understanding our triggers more. So when do we give in to temptation most and why? Maybe it's a particular time of day, maybe it's a particular emotion. I would say to people, track that for a week. You'll see some interesting patterns. In our research, we found most people were tempted at 3:30 or 8:30 in the day and the evening. But once you know that, then, we all know, for the reasons that we tend to fail, they tend to be the same things time and time again for us. But implementation intention planning involves creating a plan of action for when you go off track because of a certain trigger. So it helps you anticipate the failures and deal with them more successfully. And so what it is about asking yourself, if X happens, so if that big barrier gets in the way, then I will do Y. So, for example, if I'm trying to set up a fitness habit or a running habit, and like the day you've had today in Australia, Amanda, you go out and it's raining.
Yeah.
What are the other options for you in that situation? Especially here in well, it's certainly in Ireland anyway. If you say to yourself, well, if it's raining, I can't go for a run, then you're not going to go running very often at all. And so you've got to have an alternative plan in that situation. So if it rains when you want to go for a run, what are your alternatives? Do you have an exercise class that you can watch on demand? That you really enjoy at that time? Do you reschedule for a time later in that day? What's the second best time for you every day to go for a run if you can't go at the time that works best for you? Having a list of alternatives is really, really important because it gets us away from that all or nothing mindset. Yes. It also opens up our brain to new neurological pathways because it shows us that it isn't just one option or the other. There are multiple different options in another situation. So I say to everyone, ask themselves, what are your biggest barriers? And then come up with a list of 2-3 alternatives for that barrier. And that can really help you overcome this kind of perfectionist syndrome that we all have when it comes to habit change, and overcome that kind of all or nothing mindset.
That's fascinating. I really like the sound of that because, well, I've never done it. I have a bit of an all or nothing approach to goals, which I need to modify clearly. But I like that because if you think of the alternatives and have them written down or in your diary or something, when things don't go as planned, then you don't have to spend all that energy thinking of the alternative. You've got them written there. I think that's brilliant. It sounds simple, but it's so clever. Well, I hope you're finding my chat with Dr. Heather McKee informative. There are certainly some takeaways for me. Just a quick interlude to let you know about my new website, which you can find at www.vibrantlivspodcast.com. At the bottom of every page on my website, you'll see a box where you can subscribe to my soon-to-launch newsletter, where I'll let you know about interesting developments in the world of health and well-being, my latest podcast episodes and more, but I do promise not to be spammy. So please sign up and help me create a Vibrant Lives community. So now back to Dr. Heather McKee. Another thing that I know you talk about is modifying your environment to make your small habit changes easier. So for example, I think this is what you're referring to. So if you're trying to eat less sugary food, then presumably you try not to have chocolate in your pantry or something like that. Is that what you mean by modifying your environment?
Yeah, exactly that. I think you bring up a really important point. And the reason that I love modifying your environment is because it doesn't require willpower. So, we think that, we get home from a long day at work and, or, we've had a hard day working from home, and we go into the kitchen, if the first things we see are, high calorie foods, naturally as human beings, we're going to preferentiate them, especially if we've been suffering from a period of stress. And so it's much easier to not say to yourself, well, no, I'm not going to have them, and just rely on your willpower in that situation when you're already depleted. It's actually a lot easier to change your environment. And what they found in studies is actually those that have the most willpower are actually those that use it the least, because they've set up their environment to support their success.
While we're on the topic of willpower, can you explain to us, I guess in quite basic terms, what willpower is and why it is that we can't rely on it to get us through to achieving all of our goals?
Yeah. Well, willpower, I suppose you can call it self-control, or in ways it's kind of your own personal self-regulation. And this is where, as I said, I've mentioned before about making small changes, but it's certainly where a lot of people fall down because they rely too much on their willpower. And then when they fail, they feel like they failed as a person. Whereas, your willpower will fail. That is absolutely guaranteed. And so it's very, very important that people understand that willpower is, as soon as you're fatigued, as soon as you're stressed, as soon as you've an argument with your boss or your other half, your willpower is threatened. And so it's much more likely you'll give in to temptation. And so what we want to do is exactly like you said, Amanda, like set up our environment for success. So, make our healthiest foods the ones that we see first. Make our, roll out our yoga mat last thing at night so that it's set up there in the morning, that we almost have to trip over it, to get on and do anything else that we want to do in our day. Maybe, put your meditation journal on top of your laptop. So you have to remove that to get to your laptop. What they found in studies is proximity determines, the behaviors that you engage with. And they found in one interesting study, they gave people in offices, and they gave them sweets that were visible on their desks. And then they gave the other half sweets that were 6 feet away. And those that had them visible and in arm's reach were, I think they ate 400 calories more of sweets a week, or maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong, but they ate significantly more sweets a week than those that were 6 foot away, because they increased the friction by putting them further away. And that's what it's all about. And, for example, if you're trying to cut down on your TV watching, let's just say, and you walk into your living room and your entire living room is set up to watch the TV, your remote's by your hand, the TV is facing you, all of your furniture is facing the TV. It's going to be very, very difficult to resist. But if you put the remote in a special box, if you plug out the TV every night, if you have a code that you have to enter to actually watch the TV, if you move things around, in your home environment, you're just increasing friction. I always say you want to decrease the friction to those habits that you want to engage with and increase the friction to those you don't want to. And a primary example of this is our digital environments. Yeah. If you open your phone right now, Amanda, or any of your listeners open their phone, what is it that you see on your homepage? What are the notifications that you get? Are they, if you're wanting to meditate or get fit or whatever your habits have to be, are they around that? Are you getting notifications on engaging in meditation or daily quotes? Or if you want to create a reading habit, is the first app you see on your phone around reading? Because, where the attention goes, the brain follows. Yes. And so if we can engineer our environment to support our habits, it makes it much more likely that we'll actually engage in those habits. And we need to keep those habits visible. We need to keep them in eye line, and we need to decrease the friction to engaging in those ones that matter to us.
That's great advice. I like your advice about, I guess, harnessing tools like our phone, which we all look at all the time, to help us rather than hinder us with our habits, because it's very easy to look at your phone and get carried away looking at social media or checking your emails or whatever it is. But if you have those notifications turned off and your, meditation app or something like that pinging a little reminder to you, yeah, that's a really good idea. You're full of good ideas, Heather. I like this. We've been talking a little bit about failure. It is important, and how we can reset if we do fail, and making changes to make success more likely. So in terms of succeeding at our goals and perhaps at the small steps along the way, how do we measure success? How do we know when we're doing a good job?
It's such a good question. I would take a different stance on this than normal. So a lot of people would use particular stats to measure success, and absolutely, if you find that that's something that positively motivates you, and I'd say to anyone, like, do an audit on any kind of outcome-based goals that you do. So if you step on this, for example, like, if your weight loss is a goal that you have in mind, and you step on the scales and it tells you, what you want one day and you're happy, and it tells you maybe what you don't want one day, are you able to have the resilience to get back on the scales again? Some people do, and they find in studies that some people through daily weighing can actually, help. It helps them normalize the fact that there are fluctuations in their weight. But if that's something that's going to throw you off track, then that's not necessarily going to be the best way of you measuring success. And so for many people, and something that I advocate for measuring success is we measure success in consistency, and we measure success in feedback. And what I mean by that is, 2-3 weeks in, how are you feeling? How is your habit making you feel? Is it bringing more joy to your life? What are you gaining from engaging in this? And these are a little bit more esoteric. They're harder to measure. But an example would be, that your daily walk is giving you more energy, that actually, eating a filling breakfast is improving your focus in work. I would say, start to be a bit of a habit detective and ask yourself, what is this giving me back in my life right now? Because if it's taking away, then it's not going to be, the habit that's going to best support you. But if you feel like it's starting to give back and it's giving you different things, and the important thing here, Amanda, is you're training your brain to actually look for those rewards, to look for those things. So if you tell yourself, if you're starting to notice, your daily morning walk is giving you more energy, you're training your brain then to look for the energy it's giving you. And that's actually helping you receive more of a reward. It's training that dopamine response in your brain. That's actually the learning hormone. And so your brain starts to understand, okay, well, this is something I want to do and I want to do more of. And what's interesting about this is if we start training our brains to engage with the joy that our daily habits give us, it's much more likely that we're going to stick to them long term, because, as I said, dopamine is a learning hormone. So if we're getting joy from engaging in certain things, as opposed to, I didn't, have sugar, which is not really necessarily a joyful behavior. Saying, well, I did have fruit instead, or I went for a walk instead of sitting on the couch, actually, that's where people go wrong a lot of the times with their habits, because they focus on the hardest thing or what they didn't do, and it doesn't give them that positive dopamine response. Whereas if they focus on the joy that they're getting, the calm feeling they're getting after engaging in a breathing exercise, they're training their brain to look out for that feeling. And therefore, next time that they feel a little bit stressed, their brain's going to remind them, oh, I remember what you did in this situation. You did this calm breathing technique, and that made you feel, more positive. So I would say, if certain outcome measures help support you, then that's absolutely fine. Keep those measures. But on top of that, look for what your habits are giving you back in your life, and train your brain to be engaged with that. And the way that you can train your brain is to celebrate that. And so if your goal is, just to drink more water, every time you have a glass of water, take a second and either, you can throw up your hands in victory. You can tell someone in your house that you've drank another glass of water, depending on what type of person you are. But, or even you can just put your hand on your heart and say, I'm someone that follows through with my goals, or just feel good for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Technique called savoring from positive psychology. It's training our brains to actually understand that what we've done is a positive behavior and that we want to repeat it more often in the future. And ultimately as well, it makes you feel good about engaging in your habits. And who doesn't want to feel good about engaging in what they're doing?
It sounds a bit like being kind to yourself, because if you had a friend or a family member who was trying to pursue a goal and they were making some successful inroads, you'd be happy for them and you'd say, well done, you'd encourage them. So it's nice to think about that in terms of trying to encourage ourselves and be kind to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Heather, you have formulated a special course called the Bite-Size Habits course. It's something that people can access on your website. So can you tell us, let's talk about that a bit. But first of all, I think you've probably answered this, but let's hear it again. Why have you called it the Bite-Size Habit course? What does bite-size mean?
Yeah. So bite-size is all about not biting off more than you can chew. It's all about making those small changes. And what we ultimately know from the research is that small changes are what build cumulatively over time big results. And then they're what's going to protect your long-term success best.
Yeah, that it makes perfect sense when you explain it, but it's very interesting to hear that, because I think a lot of people, and I've certainly been guilty of this over the years, make a huge goal and don't actually know how to get from point A to point B being the goal. Heather, if someone wanted to take your bite-size habit course, how long does it take to complete it?
It's around 8 weeks to start with, and that's just really to build the foundations of habit change. But I really say it's your race, your pace. Yeah, so it's very important to kind of go at your own pace, and each individual is different. So there's 8 weeks of materials, but ultimately it's for people to take it at their own pace. And the key kind of elements really of it are that they get access to my habit blueprint and my habits framework, which are really, really important elements of behavior change. And the framework is kind of the things that we've talked about today. So there's kind of 4 key pillars, which is the mindset habit. So mastering your mindset, it's such a huge component of creating long-term change. So we start by identifying the myths or the beliefs that are holding you back and help you realize those true drivers of your habits. And then we move on to the kindness habit. And as you so rightly pointed out, Amanda, like self-punishment hampers your success. So it's really important that we give people the tools to create self-kindness habits to actually improve their motivation and their ability to stick to their goals. And then we look at the mindful habit, which is all about your thoughts and emotions and how they can drive your habits. So it's really important to know how to cultivate intuition and attention needed to overcome temptations. And then finally, the part that's really important to me is the maintenance habit.
Yeah.
So the key to seeing those lasting changes is that consistency. So maintenance is so important to me. So giving people the tools to actually help them, support them, create those long-term changes is very, very important.
Excellent. And how is your course delivered if someone wants to access it?
So it's all delivered online. So it's just at bitesizehabits.co, and that's .co. And yeah, you can find out more about the course. Actually, at the moment as well, I have a lovely little free challenge that's running. If anyone's just interested in just dipping their toe in and understanding more about what it takes to kickstart habit change, there's a 5-day bite-size habits challenge. Which is kind of 5 videos teaching you the theory of kickstarting your healthy habits, daily emails to hold you accountable, and each day I'll just ask people one simple question that takes no longer than 60 seconds to answer, but can have a really big impact on their habits. And yeah, people can follow along that for free as well at bitesizehabits.co if they want to understand a little bit more about health behaviour change.
Oh, that sounds great. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. And just to give, I guess, a flavour of what it's all about, let's look at a common habit that people might want to implement or break. And perhaps you can give us a few pointers on how to approach that. So I think a pretty popular habit that people would want to, in this case, break would be to spend less time on social media. So how would you go about that?
Yeah, great question. So what I would do, first of all, is I get people to examine the cues. So when do they give in to going on social media most in their day? So again, like we talked about a temptation diary. So when does this show up most? What's the why behind it? Why are you engaging in it? Like what's driving you to engage in it? Is it at a certain time of day you get, stuck on a project with work? Is it a distraction? Is it a procrastination tool? Is it something that you actually use out of stress or anxiety? Is it driven by loneliness and deeper reasons? And bring people through ways in which they can kind of really understand those key drivers. But one simple way that anyone can do that is, creating a temptations tracker and just asking themselves, when do I most give into this habit and why? And once we kind of understand the whys behind it, we can start to put measures in place. So we can start to put environmental measures in place. So, we can change what notifications we're getting. We can change where that app appears on our phone. We can also then maybe schedule our social media time. So when do we want it appear in our day? It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to get rid of it altogether. We might look at, when is it most useful for me to go online and connect with others? We also need to very, very importantly at the start, understand, well, what's the why behind this as well? Why is it important for me to spend less time on social media? And what does that give me back in my life? So what are the other things that I can attend to by not engaging in this? Maybe it's that you want to be more attentive to your children or more attentive with your job. Maybe you're finding that you're being more susceptible to social comparison. And so asking yourself, the why behind it is very, very important. And then starting small. So not telling yourself you're going to give up social media altogether, because that can be very, very difficult to start with. But maybe starting with, deciding, well, when are you giving in to it most in a maladaptive way? When is it least helpful in your life? So maybe it's first thing in the morning. When you wake up, you're not enjoying the way you get engaged with social media at that time. And instead of trying to do it for all of the morning, maybe just start with the first 15, 20, 30 minutes of your day. And see how that goes for a week. And if that feels laughably easy, then you can step it up to 45 minutes or to an hour. But if you find that that's becoming too difficult, don't be worried about stepping back down for a while again. And you've got these other tools and techniques that you're layering on. So you're layering on, well, what time of day is it best for me to go on social media? And then start to think about, well, what part of my house is it best for me to go on social media? And then you can set up your environment around, I actually only go on social media when I'm in this environment. So for example, if we go back to the toothbrushing example, it's not like we brush our teeth in the kitchen and the living room and everywhere else. We just do it in a certain environment. So if we can set things up in a way that actually you just do certain behaviours in certain environments, it makes it less likely that that phone's going to come with you everywhere and you're going to get engaged in that social media habit in the same way. And the final thing I would say for people to ask themselves is, when and where am I going to perform, any kind of new elements of this, or any type of reducing your social media? So any habit that you've got, always ask yourself when and where I'm going to perform it. It takes it kind of out of the clouds and puts it into the everyday life. So, is it first thing in the morning, on a Monday, on a Wednesday, and on a Friday at 8 a.m.? After my alarm goes off, I will, do my meditation practice instead of doing social media. Whatever habit we're trying to create, asking ourselves when and where it's going to show up in our lives, and experimenting with the when and where that's best for you is really, really important in terms of actually creating that consistency and creating that accountability to our habits.
What I'm hearing through our whole conversation, and what I really like, is we have to be quite practical and proactive about changing habits. It's not just a thought like I want to get fit or something like that. You really need to spend some time thinking about how to implement all the steps along the way and creating an environment where it's most likely that you're going to do those small changes.
Absolutely.
And the great thing about that is, I imagine it has flow-on effects to other parts of your life, because you've built the skill set and you're feeling more confident. And so then I imagine it encourages people to take on other healthy habits.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing. If you can build your self-confidence and your self-efficacy, if you can build your skills, that has impact on all sorts of other areas of your life. And actually, it's funny that you say that, because that's what a lot of people say. They say, I started exercising, wasn't even the habit I was focusing on, but I've just started naturally exercising more. Or improving my sleep wasn't the habit I wasn't particularly focusing on, but that just naturally started to happen for me. And you do get this cascade effect over time.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think it's time to start wrapping up this wonderful conversation. So I've got a couple of questions I like to ask at the end of the podcast episode. And first of all, because it's relevant in this day and time, how has the COVID pandemic impacted your work?
I suppose in positive ways and negative ways. In negative ways, it's we're all feeling, it's missing people.
Yeah.
Behavior change is all about humans and human behavior. And I do, I do everything from home now. Everything's digital. So, I suppose that's why I was saying that those feedback calls with course participants lit me up so much, because, it's just so nice to meet different people in different areas and chat to them about their own lives and their own habits. And I do miss that ability to do
sure.
that. In a positive way, I feel like, I do a lot of talks around healthy habit change. And I've been lucky enough to being able to do them consistently during COVID. And normally where I would have had to fly to a certain company or I would have had to travel to a certain place, I don't have to do that commute anymore. And the beautiful thing is that actually I always say that my talks are unlimited. I never limit numbers. And so I can just reach and support so many more people now. That we've moved to this digital world rather than as many people could fit in a room before. So, I really feel very, very lucky to have that opportunity and this platform to help support people and to create those healthy habits.
That has definitely been one of the silver linings, I think, of COVID, the use of digital technology to connect. Heather, who inspires you?
Oh, great question. I have to say Brené Brown because she is a total geek. I'm definitely a total geek like her, and I love kind of nerding out in the evidence space. But one of my key passions is how we make it accessible for everyone else who's not a researcher, who hasn't spent far too long in university, and then how do we take those findings that are normally only talked about in research groups or in research journals and make them accessible to everyone else. And I think that's why Brené Brown is so inspiring to me, because it's exactly what she does. And I just feel like everything she talks about is gold, and I learned so much from her.
Yeah, I agree. I think she's wonderful. And you're right. I mean, it's one thing to have all this wonderful research going on, but if it's not delivered and put into practical application for the average person, then what's the point in a way?
That's actually the reason I left academia and started my own business, because I really just wanted to be able to translate things to people in their everyday lives, and being in an academic platform, even though it's so wonderful and I loved the research and I loved learning from other researchers, I wasn't able to support people that I felt needed it most, and so that was quite important to me.
Well, thank goodness to everyone that you decided to do that. And the final question that I like to ask all of my guests is, if you could recommend 2 things that people could do to improve their well-being, and they can be absolutely anything at all, what would they be?
I'm going to talk a little bit more about mindset things, maybe. I would say, build your skill power. Stop relying on your willpower as a mean of achieving your goals. And I would also say, it's time that people stop punishing themselves with the idea that there's such a perfect way of changing their lives. And actually, give yourself the grace and the support to find your own way, and be forgiving in your failures. Look to learn from your failures, because ultimately, and this is the conclusion of one of our research studies, was failure is success if you can learn from it. And so it's a huge and important part of your health behaviour change.
Oh, wow, I love that. Failure is success if you can learn from it. Yeah, that's a really nice way to frame it, I think, because we are often very hard on ourselves. And if people would like to follow you and see what you're doing, what's the best place for them to find you?
I think the best place is probably my website, so bitesizehabits.co, and that's where people can get all the little freebies and the free 5-day challenge, and that'll give people the best insight into my work right now.
Great, excellent. And obviously I will put a link in the show notes. And Heather, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you today, and I feel like I've learned something too, so that's always a good result.
Thank you, and thank you, for asking such incredible questions. I think you've evoked all that there is, to talk about beautiful, healthy habits. So thank you for your time.
And that was Dr. Heather McKee with insightful advice on making lasting healthy habit changes. I do hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share the podcast and tell your friends about it. And if you could take a minute to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, it will help people find my podcast, and I'm always really grateful for that. You can subscribe to Vibrant Lives podcast on all good podcast providers like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and also on YouTube. Please follow me on Instagram at vibrant_lives_podcast or on Facebook at Vibrant Lives Podcast. If you'd like to contact me and talk about anything raised in any of my episodes, you can do so on the contacts page on my website. And also, if you feel like supporting the podcast, for which I'd be extremely grateful, you can have a look at the Be Involved page on my website. Thank you so much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.